Hello everyone, welcome to an experiment in English. This is of course grammaire, expression écrite, and unfortunately we are not able to see each other in person. We're going to do our best. We are just going to have class anyway, in the comfort of your own home. So of course there are of course a few words about what's happening. As you're aware, Paris 8 is upside down. So but we have to kind of figure out how to finish our semester. I don't have these. I've been talking with colleagues about solutions for taking our final exam. I will keep you posted. But let's just say that in the meantime, I wanted to sort of give you a video class we've been talking about relatives. I'm going to sum up some things. Some of you may have seen this before, some of you may not. I'm going to just give you sort of a summary on relatives, relative clauses. We're going to be talking about positive clauses, and then I'm going to be talking about subordination and coordination and strategies for dealing with texts. So we're gonna deal with those. I would say those four things, right? I'll do that. So that'll be 4 separate videos. Each will have a title. This one's going to be mainly about relative clauses, and then we'll go on from there. And that way you'll have what you need to prepare for the final exam. And as I said, I do not know. It really depends on how the strike evolves. I'm not exactly sure what the format of that final exam will be. Perhaps you will all be able to come and take it on week 12, but that doesn't seem very likely. So we'll kind of do what we can, right? Okay. So in the meantime, for those of you who want to get down to it and tackle relative clauses, let's go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be using a document that I've already given you in class, many of you in class, and I will include this as an attached document. This may look familiar. I'm trying to rotate this. This is a synthetic document, 2-page document on relative clauses. I'm just going to go through it. As I said, some of you may have seen this before. The advantage is that you can go and do something and keep this in the background, or not even watch it at all. It's up to you, right? That's the deal. So relative clauses, right? We're going to try this experiment and see if you can. I'm going to be writing sentences and saying them and see if you can read them. We'll see how that goes. So the relative clauses, the thing that I've already mentioned, but that I should remind you, is that they are not always, but almost always, essentially, we can say post modifiers in noun phrases. So it's very important to keep in mind that you need to understand a noun phrase before you can really understand what a relative clause is and does, right? So a reminder, relative clauses are post modifiers. And as a reminder, you will have also received, I've given to you, but I'm going to send you another copy of this document on the different types of, well, here we have 8 types of post modifiers in noun phrases, right? So now we've talked about what? We've talked about, we have prepositional phrases, appositive adjective phrases, and then we go on to verbal structures, right? And what we noticed was that we have non-finite and finite verbal structures. So when we talk about non-finite verbal structures, we see the familiar ones, namely verb ing clauses, which you'll find here, infinitive clauses, and then we also have a verb en clauses. Notice we will not have the bare infinitive clause. It's the only one. So of the 4 non-finite clauses that we've studied, once again, a clause is a verbal structure, right? So what are we talking about now? We're talking about inserting, if you will, as a post modifier, a verbal structure within the noun phrase. That's what it means when we say it's the post modifier. It's a part of the noun phrase, right? Part of that structure. So we have our 3 non-finite clauses, verb ing clauses, verb en clauses, and infinitive clauses, right, which we've studied before, which can be post modifiers. And as our primary finite clauses, we're going to have relative clauses and appositive clauses, right? So at the end of this video, or perhaps in another video, we'll see. I'm gonna discuss about this distinction between relative clauses and appositive clauses. That is a potential difficulty. As I've already said, there will be a question on demonstrating that a post modifier is either a relative or an appositive clause. Because if you can demonstrate that distinction, you've really understood it and you've gone somewhere as far as understanding complex sentences. So let's move on to that. Let's move on to our relative clauses. Okay. So as I've just said, so we have relative clauses, or as a clause, it's a verbal structure, right? So what that means is we can have sort of a sentence's worth of information within a noun phrase. So I'm just going to write an example of sort of try to illustrate what this can mean. In a sense, you can think of relative clauses being a way to combine two sentences, and that shouldn't be a surprise because we're talking about, complex sentences. So here we can have something like, Dave walked down the street. That's a great one. And then we can have another sentences that is going to be the street was covered in snow. So I've written these sentences here, right? Hopefully you can read them. It helps if I say them. Dave walked down. It looks like waked. No one wakes. No one wakes down the street. Dave walked down the street. This street was covered in snow, right? So as we can say, yes, we have two sentences here, and notice we have a word in common, which is, I'd love to ask you which one. You're all going to say it once. The street. So we have this idea that we have two sentences with the same noun phrase, right? The idea being, as you're aware, it would be really, when you spoke English, if you repeated noun phrases, right, over and over without using pronouns, you would sound a little bit strange. And I think I always like to talk about Hemingway novels. This is what Hemingway novels are like. You say the man walked down the street, the man did this, the man this. Don't we usually say the man walked down the street, he, right? So that, this is what we call pronominal substitution. So we can see in the second sentence, it's kind of logical that we are going to replace this noun phrase with a pronoun. And that's what pronouns are, right? And in this case, what we're going to use is going to be what we call a relative pronoun. And relative pronouns are really at the heart of a relative clause, right? So if you can understand that's sort of the pivot, right? The relative pronoun being the pronoun that's going to replace, it's hard to circle, that noun phrase, right? If you can understand that, then you've pretty much understood what a relative clause is. So that's at the heart of what's going on here. So let's do that. Let's go about operating a substitution for these sentences. So instead of having, Dave walked down the street, this street was covered in snow, we're going to say we're going to operate a substitution for the street, and we're going to use a relative clause. A relative pronoun. Instead of saying the street, we're going to say, let's say which. By the way, we can also use that, and that gives us a sentence, a new sentence with a different feel to it. That gives us the sentence, Dave walked down the street, which was covered in snow, or that was covered in snow. Okay, so in that sentence, what we should notice is we've actually constructed a big noun phrase, right? And so the idea is, I usually like to ask you to identify noun phrases in sentences, right? And we can say the first noun phrase is going to just be, this is going to be hard, Dave, right? Whoops, there you go. That's Dave. The first noun phrase is Dave. It's a minimal noun phrase. It's a proper noun, logical, no determiner, no pre-modifier, post-modifier. And the second noun phrase is going to begin with, oh, there we go. That's nice. It's going to begin here, right? We're going to play our little begin and end game. So it begins here, and it goes the street, and it's not over at the street, right? Because the is the determiner, street is the head noun. There's no pre-modifier, and so it is possible to have a head noun with a noun phrase with no post-modifier, but that's not what we have here. We have the street, which was covered in snow, or that was covered in snow, is included in the noun phrase. So what I'm saying is the street, which was covered in snow, is a noun phrase. So this is what I was trying to say when I was saying that we've sort of injected a sentence as a part of a noun phrase. So I'll underline that, and we'll put it in parentheses, and we're just going to say street, is head noun. I'm just going to write det for determiner, and which was covered in snow is, this part is the determiner head noun, and this part, which was covered in snow, or that was covered in snow, is the relative clause. So now we're going to spend some more time looking at this relative clause. So as we've seen, that the pivotal part is this relative pronoun part, which, or that which we've substituted for that noun phrase, the street, because it would be kind of silly. It would be a little bit cumbersome to say Dave walked down the street. It would be a little bit awkward. So now one thing we should ask ourselves is, well, yes, this functions as a noun, right? This relative pronoun, and what it has a role, right? It has a role in this clause. Now, once again, clause is a verbal structure, and the verbal structure and the verb that is at the heart of this structure is going to be, the verb to be was. We have our simple passive to be, and then we have which or that is going to actually be the subject of that verb. That was covered in snow, right? Of course, covered in snow is going to be our subject complement. So here we can say that what's important to see is that the relative pronoun plays a grammatical role in, we could say, the sentence pattern, right? Here it's the subject in that clause, okay? So, but it's not always the case. We can have a relative pronoun be a subject, or we can have a relative pronoun be a direct object, and so on, right? And so we're going to sort of what we're going to do now is sort of go on and look at these different cases. We're going to say, let's see a noun phrase, in which we have a relative clause, and in that relative clause, the relative pronoun will be subject, and let's have it be the direct object. Let's have it be complement of a preposition, for example. And these are the cases we're going to sort of explore to sort of get a feel for what's going on here. Okay. Now maybe there's a few things we should notice is that. Notice both when we have the relative pronoun as a subject, we have two possibilities in this case. We either have this alternance between which and that. Now notice the street is non-human, right? For non-human, and we call this an antecedent to the relative pronoun. We have which as the antecedent being the noun that it replaces is the street. When in street is always going to, the antecedent is going to be the head noun in the noun phrase. So we have which replacing street. We're going to call street the antecedent, antécédent in French, right? So here we have the antecedent, right? The thing, if you prefer, that the relative pronoun is referring to it's a non-human referent, right? Street is not a person, of course. So that means we're going to use which and not who. If it was a person, if I say, I don't know, we can't really walk down a person, but if we could say Dave called up the person, right? And I could say that I knew, or who or whom I knew. We would use who or whom, right, as the relative pronoun. So that's a thing to take into account. That is discussed in the document that you already have. Okay, so now let's look at and notice once again we can use that is completely interchangeable with that, right? And another thing to take note of, and this will be something to keep in mind when we look at our positive clauses, is we've seen other that's, right? Well, if you remember, we've seen that clauses. And in that clauses, that was not a relative pronoun, right? That might not be so obvious, right? Because we're talking about subordinate clauses. These are both subordinate clauses, right? But when we talk about a that clause, or that is going to be a subordinator, right? A subordinating conjunction. But here, that is going to be, essentially a noun, right? So they're different kinds of animals, right? And if you can, let's say, if you can identify whether that is a relative pronoun or a subordinating conjunction, you've pretty much understood the structure of the clause. Okay, so that will be something that we're going to come back to. But I just want to plant that seed to say, oh, here, that is a relative pronoun, and it might be easy to confuse with that other that, right? And that other that is, of course, the subordinator. So, as I said, now we're going to look at another sentence in which the relative pronoun doesn't replace the subject, but let's say a direct object. So to do that, let's say we have our same first sentence. Dave walked down the street. And we're going to say something like, I saw the street. Great. So, once again, we have a repetition of the street, right? And we're going to go about, substituting for that noun phrase. And as you might have guessed, we're going to use a relative pronoun. And this time what happens is going to be a little bit different. Word order is going to be different. As you noticed, in our first example, when the relative pronoun is a subject, it's obviously before the verb. It's the first, we could say it's the first part of the clause, right? Here we have something that is, the complement of the verb see, and it's at a different position, right? And that's going to bring about a difference in word order. So we have the same kind of substitution. We're not going to repeat the street. So what we're going to do is we're going to place that once again with the relative pronoun, but this time pay attention to what happens to word order. So we're going to write this. So instead of writing the street, we can actually write what we call the zero relative pronoun. We can use that, or we can use, once again, which, because we're talking about a non-human referent. And that will give us, and then we, obviously we're not going to repeat that word again. We have sort of a blank. So this gives us a sentence such as, Dave walked down the street that I saw. Oh, I'm sorry. We can start from the beginning. Ooh, this is very hard to do. This is kind of complicated. Let's get this right. There we go. Dave walked down the street I saw, or that I saw, or which I saw, right? Okay. So these are the possibilities. Okay. And this time, notice what happens is what we can notice is we always begin the relative clause here. Of course, the noun phrase is the street I saw, or the street that I saw, or the street which I saw. That is a noun phrase, right? Just like the one we saw before. So that means that I saw, that I saw, or which I saw is going to be the post modifier. And what we notice is that the relative pronoun always is found, at the beginning of our relative clause. And since it replaced a word that was at the end of the clause, there's sort of a hole there, right? There's sort of a gap. That's one way to think of it. And because this word is sort of hoisted up towards the beginning of the clause. That's it. So that's the thing to take into account. Notice there's a difference when the relative pronoun does not replace the subject. We can have this, what we call the zero relative pronoun. Which you can say it's nothing if you prefer. I mean, but it's easier to refer it to account for it by calling it the zero relative pronoun. Sometimes we just have nothing instead of that or which. Okay, so but that does not occur when the relative pronoun plays the role of a subject in the relative clause. Okay. That's it. So now we're just going to keep on going, looking at other functions. So we've seen subject, direct object. We are going to look at a complement of a preposition, and we're going to study that. And just to keep in mind, this can happen in French too, right? But there's a significant difference with French when we do this. I can say, for example, we can even do this example. I don't know. Dave s'est promené le long de la rue que j'ai vu, par exemple. That works very well, right? We have que, which is our relative pronoun. And we use que in French because it plays the role of direct object. But we could also talk about something like this. We can say, c'est quelqu'un auquel je pense. I can say that. And notice we have auquel, right? So that would be another relative clause, auquel je pense. And notice we have a preposition a, and then a plus lequel, right? Which is going to be our relative pronoun. So that we notice we have in French, we have the auquel, we have the a, the preposition which occurs at the very beginning of the relative clause, auquel je pense. I'm sorry about that sentence. I think I might have got lost halfway through. The important thing to remember is in French, we can have a relative pronoun be the complement of a preposition, right? That's no problem. But notice that the relative pronoun the preposition moves with the relative pronoun, right? They're not separated to the head of the relative clause, right? So we don't want to break up that prepositional phrase in French. So keep that in mind. Now watch what happens in English. There's a difference of what most commonly happens in English. So I think for simplicity's sake, we're still going to stop. We're going to keep on going with our our basic sentence. Dave walked down the street. It seems to be working. Dave walked down the street. And now we could sort of say something like, I've heard of the street. Why not? So I'm going to try doing this. I've heard of the street. Okay, great. So here we go. We have a similar thing going on. Repetition of our two noun phrases, the street, right? Walk down the street, I've heard of the street. And of course, so in our second sentence, which is there, we are going to go about, we're going to replace that one with a relative pronoun, okay? And if we notice, we have I've heard of the street. We've noticed that the street is a complement of that preposition of, right? A reminder of is a preposition. So that means of the street is a prepositional phrase, right? So what happens in English is what we can do is we can kind of, once again, we're going to substitute for the street, right? Okay? And then we're going to do that, of course, with a relative pronoun. And we're going to move that just to the front of the relative clause, just like we did with the second example, right? When we say Dave walked down the street that I saw, right? That relative clause moves to the front, right? So we're going to have this relative, we're going to have our relative the relative pronoun moves to the front. We're going to have a relative pronoun moving to the front, and we're going to leave this preposition behind, right? And that's going to give us, Dave walked down the street, and we're going to sort of no longer have I've heard of the street, but we're going to say the street. We're going to say the zero relative pronoun, that, or which again, which are sort of our complement forms. Okay. So we're going to say, Dave, there we go. Dave walked down the street I've heard of, that I've heard of, which I've heard of. Okay, so that's just to make you aware of the fact that there is a difference between English and French in what happens with relative pronouns when they're complements of prepositions. Okay, notice that we can, in formal English, and it is a little bit cumbersome, and to be honest, it is most often perceived as awkward in everyday English. We can move the prepositional phrase as a whole. In other words, we can also move the of, and we would get the sentence, Dave walked down the street of which I've heard, right? Okay, so we notice that of, if I can find, it's hard not to go backwards here. We can have that of will move with the relative pronoun to the front. And notice when we do that, we can't use we don't say of I've heard. We don't say of that I've heard. We have to use which, right? And for this reason, some people think of which being sort of a more legitimate relative pronoun than that. There's actually a debate. Some people say that isn't a real relative pronoun. That's a question that's something to think about. When you move on. I don't want to say that this is all these things are absolutely true. You might want to keep that somewhere in your brain and think, ooh, there's a debate going on somewhere whether that is really a relative pronoun or not. Now, this might give you some hint as to why. Does it really behave does it really behave as much as a relative pronoun as which? That's sort of an open question, if you will. So once again, we can say Dave walked down the street I've heard of, that I've heard of, which I've heard of, right? Or if we want to move our preposition to the head of the relative clause, we're going to say Dave walked down the street of which I've heard. And you can hear that, right? Dave walked down the street of which I've heard. You're scratching your beard. We feel like we're in a Victorian novel. It's a little bit, it's formal. It's perceived as formal, much more today than, let's say, 30 years ago, but still, we have that. Now I would just like to perhaps briefly talk about what happens when we use who and whom. Just look at some examples, similar things. As I said, we use the relative pronoun who or whom when we have human antecedents, right? So, sorry, I'm having a problem with this stuff. So that means we're no longer going to talk about Dave walking on the street. We're going to say something about Lucy. We're going to say, I called up Lucy, and we're going to have another sentence, which is going to be Lucy was wearing address. Okay, I called up Lucy. Whoops. I called up Lucy. Lucy was wearing a dress. Okay, I don't know how clear that is, right? Once again, as you will have already guessed, we want to have a, so we want to go about substituting for that noun phrase Lucy. So we're gonna, I'm not even gonna write it all the way out. We're just gonna say I called up Lucy instead of writing Lucy. We're gonna cross that out and write who was wearing a dress, right? And as is evident from the fact that we started with, a sentence, we can say that we can always say there's sort of an adjacent sentence, sort of a potential, virtual adjacent sentence in a relative pronoun. We can say that we can see that Lucy is the subject of that sentence. Lucy was wearing a dress, which shows us that the function, right, of who is going to be the subject in that relative clause. Okay, and because of that, we're never going to say whom here. I'm never going to say I called up Lucy whom was wearing a dress. That would be an example of overcorrection, as they say in French, hypercorrection. It would be you just be trying to say something fancy. It would be de l'esbrouf, as we like to say, and that's a good way to make a fool of yourself. If you actually know grammar, you'd say, why is this person saying that? So the idea is we use who when the relative pronoun is a subject. Okay. This, and as you might now be able to guess, this the whom form, right, is sort of the complementary form for whom. It is going to be the relative pronoun that we use for when the relative pronoun is a complement, either of the verb or a preposition, right? It is a complement, and the antecedent is human. So we're going to start. We're going to have our same example of calling up Lucy. I called up Lucy, and we could say something like, I know Lucy. Well, that'd be silly. Of course I know Lucy. Who else knows Lucy? We're going to say that Steve, I think we've already had Dave. Steve knows Lucy. And you can see, this is, once again, I always think be aware of this writing style made popular in the 20s. If you were, I said, really try to know how to read. You should know how to read Hemingway now. I called up Lucy. Steve knows Lucy. That's Gertrude Stein or Hemingway, something like that, right? But we're probably going to say something like that. Oh, I called up Lucy, who or whom Steve knows. So we're gonna replace Lucy once again, but this time Lucy is as you can all guess, Steve knows Lucy. Lucy is the direct object, right? So that means we're going to use our complement form of who, which is going to be whom. But today, it doesn't matter. If you are very old school, you're going to say, oh, I called up Lucy whom Steve knows, right? And that is grammatically impeccable because whom is the complement of know, right? And so that the form of the pronoun reflects that, right? But most people today, it is actually considered to be correct to say, I called up Lucy who Steve knows, okay? And that, I don't know, I want to say it's been considered to be correct for 30 years, but that's a rough estimate. I don't really know, but it's accepted now, okay? Because it's whom is perceived as a little bit stuffy, a little bit too formal. A reminder: we can also use that, right? That is we can also use that in this sentence, okay? So I called up Lucy, who Steve knows, whom Steve knows, and that Steve knows. Okay, we have that. So now I'd like to look at an example when we have a complementary preposition. We have to use whom. So I'm not going to write it up, but I'll just give you an idea. So instead of saying, I called up Lucy, Steve knows Lucy, we could say heard of. Instead of knowing, we could say Steve has heard of Lucy. So I've called up Lucy, Steve has heard of Lucy, okay? And so we could say, I called up Lucy, who Steve has heard of, whom Steve has heard of, that Steve has heard of. Or if we have of in the beginning of a relative relative clause, we're going to have, I called up Lucy, of whom Steve has heard. So if we do, and I've already said this is formal, if we decide to have, if our relative pronoun is a complement of a complement of a preposition of, right? And we decide to, if we're speaking in a very formal way, if we decide to bring of up to the head of our relative clause, right? That means we are keeping the relative pronoun as a complement of the preposition of, right? Then we need to use whom because it immediately follows the preposition and it needs to reflect that, right? So in that case, we need whom. So if I say, for example, I called up Lucy, of whom Steve has heard, and that sounds a little, ooh, of whom Steve has heard, we're not going to say of that, we're not going to say of who, we can't say of who, Steve. Maybe, hopefully you can hear this, right? And it's nice to know why, because in this case, whom immediately follows the preposition of, right? And of course the function of that, of whom, is going to be complement of a preposition because you know the structure of a prepositional phrase, and we need the form, the complement form to reflect that because it's right after it. Otherwise, we can kind of get away with it, okay? That's one way to think of it, okay? So that's pretty much it for, I would say, the basic relative pronouns playing a diversity of functions. What are the functions we've seen? We've seen the subject, direct object, and complement of preposition, and we've seen this with inhuman antecedents and human antecedents, right? So that's sort of a basic run-through. Now, there's something a little bit more, another grammatical role that is a little bit more complicated. And this is when we have a relative pronoun that is actually actually a determiner, right? And that might seem a little bit strange. We don't think of nouns, because pronouns, we don't think of nouns being determiners. But if you remember, when we talk about what we call a possessive or the genitive, right, we can have a noun phrase as a determiner. So I'm going to discuss that. I'm going to just remind you of that. We're going to look at a noun phrase like, let's say we're going to talk about a champion. And we're going to talk about the champion has a vest that was blue, right? So we're going to say the champion's vest was blue, right? Okay, so there's a wonderful sentence. The champion's vest was blue. Now here we have, I wish I could find a better way to do this. I'm sorry about this. It's, as you know, we're doing the best we can here. We have our noun phrase, the champion's vest. Okay, that's our noun. Hopefully we can notice the head. What is it? Is it a champion or is it a vest that is blue? It's a vest, right? So that means vest is our head noun, right? Vest is our head noun. I'm just going to write HN for, for the purpose of simplicity. And if we have it now, the idea is we could have said blue vest, we could have said the champion's green, blue. We could have added something to sort of restrict the notion. We could have added a pre-modifier, but we don't. We have no pre-modifier. There's no pre-modifier here. The champions, right, apostrophe S, this is what we call we sometimes refer to this as the genitive or the genitive case, or we can also refer to this as a possessive. And it's important to note that this is a determiner. We could say, notice, his vest. We could replace that with the possessive adjective, which is a determiner. We could say this vest, the vest. It's the best way to convince yourself that something has a certain grammatical role, to sort of replace it with the other words that have that same role. So the champion's vest, his vest, this vest, the vest. That works. So that's a way to convince yourself that the champions, right, is in fact a determiner. Okay, so that means, what does that mean? When we have this apostrophe S, this makes this noun phrase be in the genitive case, or be a possessive. We actually have a noun phrase that is a determiner. That's its grammatical function, right? So that's what I was saying a second ago, and I think it was a good idea to sort of remind ourselves of how that works. So, now what we can think about, what happens when we have pronominal substitution with this kind of a noun phrase, right? So I'm going to have to use my imagination to come up with an example. Yes. I'd like to keep this the champion's vest was blue. This will be our second sentence. I'm going to write it again lower. I like this idea of writing the champion's. I'm going to write it again. Vest was blue. And we're going to say something like, I talked to the champion. So if I'm Gertrude Stein and I'm writing a novel in the 20s, I say the 1920s, I'm going to say, I talked to the champion's vest was blue. I don't feel like doing that anymore. I want to move on to another way of writing. I'm going to say, I talked to the champion, I would say dont en français. Dont, c'est des plus pronom relatif. Et ça, c'est une manière de construire le possessif en français. Des, des plus, groupe nominal. L'ami de Pierre, pas à Pierre. All right? So, in English, what we're going to do is we're going to substitute for the champion. But as we've seen, we have the champion in this sentence. The champion. We've just seen that in the champion's vest was blue. The champion is the determiner, right? So we're going to need. We're going to replace this with a special. If you prefer, we can use a special relative pronoun, the one that has the function of determiner, and that's what whose is, and it's whose, right? So we're going to go about replacing that. And we're going to end up with, I talked to the champion which champion? The champion whose vest was blue, right? That's our sentence. I talked to the champion whose vest was blue, if you prefer. And one thing to note is this possessive relative pronoun, whose, oh boy, okay, is always going to be followed by a noun, whose vest, okay? It's logical, it's a determiner. Determiners are going to be followed by the noun of which they are the determiner, of course. So that's a thing to keep in mind. And you're going to need to practice this. This is what we're going to do. I'm going to send you, I've already given some of you some sentences that we sort of translate, in French, but you're going to need to have I would memorize a sentence such as j'ai parlé au champion dans la veste. C'est pas dans la veste. Dans la veste était bleue. Super. J'ai parlé au champion dont la veste était bleue, and that would be I talked to the champion whose vest was blue. Okay, so often beware of dont. Right, there might be a difference in preposition. It doesn't always work, but I would say this dont in French, right? That's de. Very often de plus pronom relatif. Okay, this one of the it's very likely to be translated by whose. And be aware that it's going to be whose followed by a noun phrase, right? It's not so. That's a difficulty, right? It's the first time I had to translate, I had to use dont in a French sentence. It was tough. Right? It was not easy. It didn't go very well. I came up with a very bad sentence, right? So we're getting there, right? I think we're okay. We're not so bad. There's just a few things I would like to see. There's another. Sort of a less obvious case. And we've actually seen these when we notice we've already seen something more complicated. We've already seen nominal relatives, right? But we have a series of WH words that can be relative pronouns, right? I'm very sorry about the light. I'm trying to. This is just a big blank. There we go. Excuse me. We're doing what we can here, right? So if we notice that you already have this, right? This sheet, we have this where, when, and why, right? And so we can use these WH, as we said here, we can use these WH words as relative pronouns, right? Okay. I live in a city. I study in a city. I live in a city. I live in a city where I study. What we're doing is, once again, it should be understood that if we have that sentence, so this is easier. The city where I study, in that sentence that you can see, is a noun phrase, right? And where I study is the relative clause, right? It might seem a little bit strange. We have a locative here. You might not think of where replacing a noun. It doesn't. We can't say that it replaces the noun city. That would be inexact. Nonetheless, right? In this case, this is still considered to be a relative clause. Okay, so I would just be on the lookout for these different. These are sort of less canonical relative clauses, but they are nonetheless fully legitimate relative clauses. So be on the lookout for these WH words as relative pronouns. We've already seen the reason why, the time when. If you remember when we looked at nominal relatives, we say this is when we go. We said this is the time when, right? We've already seen this before. And this is where, this is the place where, right? Okay, if you remember, what we said was in these cases where we have nominal relatives, this is where I live, this is when we talk, this is why we left, right? This is the place where I live, this is the time when we talk, this is the reason why, right? We said that in these WH words there was a hidden antecedent, right? And that's what we have when we say I live in this city, where we have the antecedent is the city, all right? That's all I'm really going to say about that. I don't want to make that any more complicated than it is. This might seem a little bit unusual because you may be asking yourself the question, wait a second, I don't see how, where, when, or why replace nouns. Well, I say they don't. They're not. So in a sense, we could say they're not really canonical relative pronouns. They're sort of alternative, if you prefer, relative pronouns. And you might find that not satisfying, so you might want to write a grammar book and explain that it should be different. That's what happens. So I hear your complaint. It is a legitimate complaint. That's just what happens with grammar. We have these kind of cases where we kind of want to fit something into a category, even though it doesn't satisfy all the conditions. I would say that a canonical case would satisfy. Okay, so I hope that is clear. And that is most everything as far as relative pronouns are concerned. Oh, by the way, this is, and I would suggest, this obviously these are complementary. I haven't gone through this thing, sentence by sentence, but this will kind of, here we are. I see we're at 41 minutes, right? It's time for a coffee break, right? But go back and forth between, this video, and then this document, and hopefully with those two things you'll be ready for relative pronouns. Now what I would like to do is talk about one other distinction that I think is in the beginning, given the beginning of this document, which is between defining and non-defining relative clauses, often called restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses. Okay, here, so you can see this on the document here. And this is basically about commas, right? And this once again means that we should look and sort of ask ourselves questions about the structure of a noun phrase. So, and another thing that's good to know is this is similar in French, right? This is you've seen this in French. So we can. I'm trying to think of an example that would illustrate this. I could give you a classic. The one that I've heard in French a lot would be when we have sort of a subcategory. Let's say we're talking about skiers, right? And not all we're talking about a group of skiers, right? And some of the skiers are wearing masks and others aren't, right? So we start with we're mentioning the skiers. I'm writing this sentence here, okay? The skiers, right? And now we want to create that subcategory. So we're going to add a post modifier. The skiers, that would be a noun phrase, and we're going to expand on this noun phrase. We're going to add a post modifier to create a subcategory, to refine and restrict that notion. That's why we're going to call this a restrictive, right, or a defining relative clause. We want to restrict that notion, sort of create a subcategory. So we're going to say which ones. The skiers, I could say who or which, we could say who or that, right? I'll say who. You'll see why in a second. Well, notice I'm going to say that or who were, I don't know, wearing masks fell down. So I can say the skiers who were wearing masks fell down, or the skiers that were wearing masks fell down. No problem. They're both legitimate sentences. Wonderful. Great. And as you see, that our noun phrase is the skiers who are wearing masks. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call the construction of the referent. The idea is, we use noun phrases to refer to things or people. So how do these words sort of say what we're talking about, right? How do we identify, who we're talking about? So we start with this notion of skiers, right? Okay. Now I could have said tall skiers or short skiers or fat skiers, I don't know what, to sort of fine tune that notion, that would have been a pre-modifier. The big skiers, I don't know, skinny skiers, who knows? And then we have, and as you see, we use that post modifier really to contain a sentence worth of information to be very specific about creating a subcategory. So, so instead of saying tall, we say, that we're wearing masks. So one way to think of the construction of the referent is to say we start with the most general, the head noun, skiers, right? We apply the pre and the post modifier to restrict the notion. Who are wearing masks, that we're wearing masks, right? We've kind of fine-tuned that, heavily fine-tuned that notion, right? And then as far as the order of constructing the referent, then we apply the definite article. Now, definite, as the word reveals, that is as a way of sort of sealing or fixing, if you prefer, what the noun phrase refers to. Once we have the determiner, right, we have determined, right, who or what the referent, if you were. We said this is what the noun phrase refers to. So what happens when we have a non-restrictive or a restrictive or a defining relative here, right? We have skiers, then we have pre-modifier, post-modifier. In this case, the post-modifier is our defining relative clause. And then we have the, which intervenes, and that's sort of the end of the construction of the referent. Okay, I hope that's kind of clear, but it'll become a little bit clear when we compare it to what happens when we have a non-defining or a non-restrictive relative clause. So, we can have the same words, but, said differently, can refer to a different thing. We can say the skiers, and then we have a sort of a pause, and so we're going to have a comma to indicate that pause, right? So the skiers, and notice this comma means, we're going to say the same thing. We're going to say who are wearing masks, just like we said in the preceding example, right? But this time we're going to have a comma. The fact that we have the comma there means that that definite article has already fixed. All right, the referent has already been, rendered unchangeable. We've already said the skiers, and we've already referred to the group of skiers, right? So that means we can have the same, what appears to be the same relative clause. We can say who were wearing masks, and I'm going to have notice we're going to have commas here to indicate that we're constructing the referent in a different way. So we're going to say the skiers who are wearing masks fell down. And no, the intonation is important. No, there's usually in phonetics we note that there's a dip in intonations. The skiers who are wearing masks, and there's something kind of parenthetical. This is sort of not necessary information. This is not defining. This is not restrictive. This is sort of, think of this as being sort of, we could have written, notice punctuation. It would have been completely legitimate to put parentheses or dashes, not a hyphen. We could have dashes or parentheses. We could have use them instead of these commas to indicate this is sort of parenthetical, right? This is not necessary. We're just adding we're not adding this information to say who or what we're talking about. We're just sort of adding this as an aside, extra information. You can think of that, right? So the skiers who were wearing masks fell down, and so you can see that we're not. What that means is all the skiers fell down. We're saying the skiers fell down. Oh, by the way, they were wearing masks. We're not creating a subcategory of skiers who were wearing masks. In the first example, the skiers who were wearing masks fell down. We're saying there were a lot of skiers, and there was a little group who were wearing masks, and those who were wearing masks fell down. Ceux qui, portaient un masque sont tombés. Right? Mais il n'y avait que ceux qui portaient le masque qui tombaient. Mais ici, on dit oui, les skieurs tombaient, ou il se trouve qu'en fait, en guise de parenthèse, une espèce d'aparté, en fait, ils portaient des masques. Mais je n'ai pas dit ils portaient des masques pour désigner une sous-catégorie de skieurs. Voilà. Donc, that's our little lesson on relative clauses. I hope this is comprehensible. Of course, it's I hope it's as easy. I feel as if this is an experiment. I feel as if. I don't know. I prefer to have you asking questions. It's not the ideal teaching situation, but we're not in the ideal situation. We're kind of doing what we can, and I will keep you up to date as to how we're going to go about finishing up the semester. But practice, use this lesson and that other document, sort of get a sort of fairly clear view of what's going on, and then work on those those sentences on translation, and then that's it. So the next we're gonna have another video. I said it depends on the order. Is going to be about positive clauses. That'll be a shorter video on a